Welcome back once again to our Creature Feature segment. This segment we're going to be talking about the horseshoe crab, and here with us is Mr. Mark Maddox, who is a biologist with the South Carolina Department of Natural Resources. He's going to be assisted by Austin, who's our 10th grade student from Georgetown High School.
Okay, Louis, obviously they call it a horseshoe crab because it's the front part of it is shaped sort of like a horseshoe. At one time they called it a king crab, but that got confusing since one of the larger crabs caught up in Alaska is a king crab. Now this critter actually is not a crab. It is an arthropod, and arthropods are those animals that have a shell on the outside rather than an internal skeleton like we do. So as they grow, they have to molt the shell and come out. Most crustacea come out backwards out of the shell. When these guys molt, they actually break across the front of the shell and move out forward. It takes them a lot longer than it does for a blue crab to come out. Now the reason I say this is not a crab is because it's actually closer kin to scorpions and spiders. They probably had a common ancestor millions and millions of years ago. The reason you can tell that is if you look right here at the front, you'll see that little bitty pair of pinchers. They're not very strong, but they allow the animal to feed itself. The other thing that sort of gives it away is if you look back here on the gills, if you can see in there, they're little bitty lamella. They call them book gills. So book gills and these little pinchers up front are very common in scorpions, spiders, and the horseshoe crab. Now, are these closely related to scorpions and spiders? Not really. They probably had an ancestor over 450 million years ago. So this critter, if you look along the back of the tail part, you'll see the little paired holes along there. This one's ancestor actually had different segments, hinge segments all along there. And they go back in the fossil record to over 500 million years. This particular shape with the main head, this back part, and a tail, this goes back to 430 million years ago. Now, the reason this animal, a lot of people say that's a very primitive animal. This is not a very primitive, this is an ancient animal. This is a design that's worked really well for longer than almost anything else on Earth has been around. And the reason is, if you'll notice, the animal has all these legs and all these soft parts are well protected by this shield. It's like a tank is what it's like. Now, the reason it has a tail is that during its reproductive cycle, it does an odd thing is that these animals actually lay their eggs in the intertidal zone. In other words, between low tide and high tide. They actually come up through there, up through the water, and the males, and we'll get a male out, Austin, if you wouldn't mind. They come up, and the males are normally attached to the female right at the very back here, and they hold on to it, and she goes and digs down into the sand, maybe 8 inches or so at max, and she lays little bitty batches of eggs. When I say little bitty, that might be a couple of hundred, is up to several thousand at a time. And then she'll move a little further up the beach, dig another hole, and lay them again. The female, if you look at this part right here, the female has their little bitty openings right down there on this first abdominal segment where the eggs will actually come out. Now, I told you that the males tend to hang on to the female during this mating process. So Austin's got a male here, and I'll show you the way you can tell a sexually mature male. If you look at this first pair of little, it's actually right after the little chili, the little pincher things that they feed with. You see this odd looking leg that looks like a boxing glove with a hook on it? That is designed to grab right at the very back end of the female. So this male will hang on to her, and then once she's dug the egg and begins to push out eggs, he literally will go and add sperm to the eggs. Now this is true external fertilization. In other words, the eggs are put out in little packets, little gummy packets, and the sperm are squirted out by the male, and he's tough too. His little, this is the he. If you look on the he here, you look right down at the bottom, you see those little pointy things? Yeah. That's where the sperm would come out. Thank you, I appreciate that.
We have a question, Mark.
Yes. What's the sperm?
Well, sperm is the male part that will reproduce with the egg. In other words, you take an egg and a sperm and you get a baby. And so the males make the sperm and the females make the eggs. And the reason I mention this external fertilization is because it's very rare in the arthropods to have external fertilization. Most of them have sperm that are in little packets called spermatophores, and they attach them to the female, and then the female's eggs pass through them. This guy literally just puts it in the water right behind the female. And if you notice on these animals, they generally do this to move water through the front part. If you look at the very front edge, you can see it's got a little opening, so that when it's going along the bottom, water comes through there and runs out. When she gets ready to actually lay her eggs, she reverses the flow of these little things, and that helps pull the sperm from the male behind her up front. Now, the other thing that she has, you see these sort of back legs that look like push poles? Well, those, they do help them, in fact, because these animals crawl along the bottom and sort of dig around and eat mostly clams and little worms. Clams they really love. On the female, let me...
Mark, while you're doing that, we have a couple of people who have been concerned and asking online whether we're hurting the crab. We see they see us trying to open up the crab, and especially handling the tail like this. Can you just explain that we're not hurting it?
Very strong animals. As a matter of fact, you could probably take this animal out of water, just keeping it damp, for 24 hours and put her right back in the water, and she'd go right about her business. I just wanted to be able to show you on a live animal what's going on. Now, I am trying to be a little bit careful with this thing here because it's obviously got little stickers on it, and you can see it stuck me already. But I just want you to see all the pieces and parts. These are very durable animals. Anything that's survived for 400-something million years, pretty tough animal. There's one fossil that was found. It's around 250 million years ago, still before dinosaurs, that literally looks exactly like this morphologically. Now, is it exactly like this? No, everything evolves. There may be other processes, but as far as the shell and the legs, identical. 250 million years old. And an awful lot of animals right around 250 million years old. Most of the species on Earth died probably due to glaciation, to an ice age. So they've been around a long time. Now, what's kind of interesting on them too is that the mouth on them is right down here. So because they're close to spiders and such, and you might recall that spiders inject poison and sort of dissolve and then suck up their food, what this girl does is she puts the food down at the base of these legs and then uses the legs to crunch little clams and such. And then she swallows them in the mouth, and they go into a little gizzard, and it grinds it up even more. And then before it goes into the gut and the hepatopancreas, which is where everything is dissolved, they'll actually just spit up the shell that they don't want. So it's really an interesting critter in that respect.
Okay, we have a good question on the blood of the horseshoe crab. I know a lot of people have heard about the blue blood, and this is coming from Prue High School in Oklahoma. Why is the blood blue? And we just have a couple of minutes, Mark.
All right. All arthropods have, instead of having hemoglobin with iron in it, they have hemocyanin, which means that their blood, their pigment for carrying oxygen has copper in it. If you get oxygen with something that has copper in it, it actually turns blue. Now, the interesting thing about this blood in this animal is they found out about 1955 that when you pierce one of these animals and bacteria invade it, then they have an incredible reaction. They have one type of blood cell. The hemocyanin is just in the juice. And that blood cell is very sensitive to bacterial contamination. So the importance in this state to this animal is that we protect them, because there's a whole industry, and without a component from this animal's blood, it'd be very difficult to assay bacterial contamination in IV drugs or fluids or blood or surgical instruments. So in South Carolina, since 1991, we don't allow anyone to take them and use them for bait. They're still taken for bait in quite a few places along the coast, but not in South Carolina. In South Carolina, they can take and bleed them, and where they would do is go in the pericardial site, right through there with a big old needle, and they would drip out about as much as 30% of this animal's blood. And they would use that to spin out the large blood cells, and from them they get this limulus amoebocyte lysate, and it is the most sensitive for bacterial contamination that anyone's found yet. And they have not come up with a synthetic way to replace it. So this animal, especially this, now that we have terror problems, and it is possible that you could really kill a lot of people by contaminating things like that, this is a very important animal. Been here a long time, has some really unique characteristics, needs to be here a lot longer.